Stepson said I mean nothing to him. So when it came to paying for college, I did this. People say love can conquer all. But what happens when love isn't enough? For years, I thought I had built a family. I thought that by giving, supporting, and always being the responsible one, I could earn the love and respect of my stepson. But in the end, I was just the ATM, the walking wallet who was there to pay the bills, keep the house running, and make sure everyone else's needs came first. And when I finally said no, that's when they showed me who they really were. I met Melissa at a time when I wasn't even looking for love. I had just opened my wine bar, pouring everything I had into building a business from the ground up. She was smart, hardworking, and had this quiet strength about her that I admired. She worked as a bookkeeper, and when I hired her to help with my accounts, I didn't expect to fall for her. But I did. And when she introduced me to Ethan, her son, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to be her partner. I was going to be his father, too. Ethan was only 12 years old when I entered his life. His biological father, Kevin, was already out of the picture, a washed-up alcoholic who had lost custody years ago. Melissa told me Kevin was unreliable, reckless, and always full of excuses. He would disappear for months, then suddenly show up, making empty promises about how he was getting his life together. And Ethan? He had been disappointed too many times. So I stepped in. I took him to sports games. I taught him how to ride a bike. I paid for his school trips, his hobbies, his birthdays. And for a while, I thought I was making a difference. But I didn't realize. Ethan was just waiting for his real dad to come back. Looking back, there were red flags. He never called me dad, always just Robert. When Kevin did show up, Ethan treated me like I didn't exist. Melissa always told me to give them time. But time never changed anything. I thought that as he grew older, things would change. That he'd see that I was the one who was always there, who put food on the table, who kept a roof over his head, who made sure he had every opportunity to succeed. But in the end, blood was thicker than effort. And no matter what I did, I was never going to be enough. Ethan's 18th birthday was supposed to be a milestone, a celebration of everything I had done for him. I rented out my own wine bar for the event, sparing no expense to make it special for him and his friends. The night was going perfectly until Kevin showed up, drunk, slurring his words, acting like he was the guest of honor. And instead of being embarrassed, Ethan was thrilled. At first, I held back. I wasn't going to let Kevin ruin the night. But then he raised his glass, smirked at me, and said, "Let's hear it for Ethan's real father, huh?" Laughter rippled through the guests. I expected Ethan to say something, to shut it down, to defend me. But he didn't. He just smiled and nodded, like Kevin had been there all along, like I was nothing. After that night, something shifted in me. I started noticing things I had ignored before. Ethan only came to me when he needed something: money, rides, favors. When I tried to connect with him, he kept me at arm's length. Melissa never truly backed me up when it came to setting boundaries. For 6 years, I had been trying to be the best stepfather I could be. But in the end, I wasn't his father. I was just the guy who paid for everything. And soon, I was going to prove it. Because the next time Ethan needed something, I wasn't going to give it. A child's 18th birthday is supposed to be a celebration of growth, family, and new beginnings. For Ethan, it was the day I realized I was never truly his father. And for me, it was the day I stopped pretending to be. I had planned everything. Ethan had always wanted a big, extravagant party, something he could brag about to his friends. So I gave it to him. I rented out my own wine bar for the night. I hired a private chef to cater the event. I made sure every detail was perfect. I thought, after all these years, he'd finally see how much I cared. That he'd understand that I wasn't just his mother's husband. I was his father in every way that mattered. But that night, I learned the truth. The music was blasting. The guests were laughing. Ethan was having the time of his life. And then, the doors swung open, and in stumbled Kevin, reeking of cheap whiskey, dressed in a wrinkled button-down, barely tucked in, wearing a self-satisfied smirk, like he belonged there. "What's up, birthday boy?" he slurred, raising a beer bottle in the air. The room fell silent. And me? I just stood there, watching. waiting to see how Ethan would react. I expected Ethan to be embarrassed, to apologize, to tell his so-called father to leave. But instead, he grinned. "Dad, you made it." My stomach dropped, not just because Ethan welcomed him, but because of what he did next. He grabbed the microphone, looked around the room, and said, "Let's hear it for my real father, everyone." And the room erupted into cheers. I can't even describe what I felt in that moment. I had spent 6 years raising him. I had given him everything. And yet, in front of all his friends, in front of everyone who mattered, he erased me completely, like I had never been there at all. I locked eyes with Melissa, expecting her to say something, to defend me, to remind Ethan who had actually raised him. But she just gave me a weak, helpless look, like this was just one of those things I had to accept. And that's when I knew. I wasn't just not his father. I was never even part of his family. Kevin, now fully enjoying the spotlight, swaggered over to me. He clapped me on the back, his breath hot with alcohol, and said, "Come on, Rob. No hard feelings, huh? The kid knows who his real dad is." I clenched my fists so hard my knuckles turned white. I wanted to knock him out right there. But instead, I smiled. "Yeah, Kevin, he sure does." And I walked away, not just from the conversation, but from them. Because if Ethan truly believed Kevin was his father, then it was time to let Kevin take full responsibility. After Ethan's birthday, something inside me shifted. I stopped trying. I stopped pretending we were a family. I stopped caring. Because why should I? I had given this kid everything. Time, love, money, only for him to throw it back in my face. But the real test? The moment that truly broke everything? That came at his graduation. After Kevin crashed the party and Ethan publicly humiliated me, things between us were tense. We weren't arguing, but we also weren't talking. Ethan avoided me completely. Melissa acted like nothing happened. I stopped making an effort to engage. And honestly, it was freeing. I stopped reminding Ethan about his responsibilities. I stopped paying for his weekend outings. I stopped doing anything for him at all. If he didn't want me to be his father, then I wouldn't be. But Melissa? She still expected me to fund his future. Because, of course, I was still the provider. And I didn't say no, not yet, because I was waiting for the perfect moment. And it came at his graduation. Ethan's high school graduation should have been a proud moment. I had paid for his entire education, making sure he had every opportunity to succeed. And when the time came, I still showed up. Not because I wanted to, but because I knew Melissa expected it. But the second I arrived, I regretted it. Because standing at the entrance, laughing, shaking hands, acting like the proudest father alive, was Kevin. Again, I turned to Melissa, voice low. "You invited him?" She sighed. "Robert, please. Ethan wanted him here. Let's not make a scene." I let out a dry laugh. "So I'm just the guy who pays for everything, but he gets to be the proud dad in public?" She didn't answer. Because she didn't have to. The truth was already clear as day. During the graduation reception, Ethan gave a speech thanking the people who had shaped his life. He thanked his teachers, his friends, his mother. And last, he raised his glass, smiled, and said, "And of course, my father, Kevin. Thanks for always believing in me, Dad." I sat there, watching the man who had done nothing for him, the man who had been absent for most of his life, bask in the moment. And me, the man who had paid for everything, the one who had been there through every scraped knee, every failed test, every moment of doubt, I didn't even get a mention. And that was when I decided. Ethan was on his own. Melissa and Ethan had been so sure I would pay for his college tuition. They had never even asked, just assumed that I would continue footing the bill, like I always had. But after that graduation speech, I was done. So a few weeks later, when Ethan sat at the dinner table and casually mentioned his NYU tuition deposit, I smiled. "Oh, I'm not paying for that." Melissa's fork clattered onto her plate. Ethan froze mid-sentence. "Wait, what?" I leaned back, arms crossed. I said, "I'm not paying for it. You've made it clear who your real father is. Let Kevin handle it." The silence that followed was the most satisfying thing I had ever experienced. For years, I had been the one who paid for everything. Every school trip, every soccer uniform, every expensive hobby Ethan picked up and dropped just as quickly. I never complained. I never asked for recognition, because I thought that's what being a father meant. But after his graduation speech, after he had the audacity to thank his real dad while completely ignoring me, I realized something. I was just a paycheck to him, and the second I stopped paying, everything would fall apart. A few weeks after graduation, we were having dinner like everything was normal. Melissa and Ethan were laughing, talking about his NYU move-in date. I sat there, listening, waiting, because they had never even asked me about tuition. They had just assumed, and I was about to prove them wrong. Ethan turned to me, grinning. "So, Rob, I sent in my tuition deposit today. I figured we should start sorting out the payments soon." I took a sip of my wine, and then I said the words that shattered their world. "Oh, I'm not paying for that." The room went dead silent. Melissa's fork clattered onto her plate. Ethan blinked, his grin faltering. "Wait, what?" I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. I said, "I'm not paying for it. You've made it pretty clear who your real dad is. Let Kevin handle it." Ethan stared at me, as if I had just spoken a foreign language. Melissa's face twisted in anger. "Robert, this isn't funny." I shrugged. "I'm not joking." And then, Ethan lost it. "Are you serious right now? You're really gonna do this just because I didn't mention you in my speech?" Ethan scoffed. I raised an eyebrow. "It's not just the speech, Ethan. It's years of disrespect. It's years of you treating me like an outsider while I paid for everything you needed." His face turned red. "So you're just gonna abandon me? After everything you've done?" I laughed. "You don't get it, do you? I already did everything, and you never cared." Melissa slammed her hands on the table. "He's just a kid, Robert. He made a mistake." I turned to her, my voice calm and final. "He's 18. That's not a kid anymore. He made his choice, and now he can deal with the consequences." Ethan went from furious to desperate real fast. "NYU is expensive. We don't have that kind of money." I smiled. "That's not my problem." Melissa turned pale. "Robert, please. We can figure this out together." "You don't need me," I said, standing up. "You have Kevin. I'm sure he'll take care of his son." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Kevin doesn't have that kind of money, and you know it." I grabbed my plate and carried it to the sink. "Not my problem." And for the first time, I meant it. For years, I had been the provider, the reliable one, the man who fixed every problem. I thought if I just kept giving, one day, I'd be recognized, appreciated, loved. But that night, as I watched Melissa and Ethan spiral, I realized they never saw me as family. They saw me as a wallet. And now that I had finally closed the bank, they were screwed. Melissa followed me into the kitchen, her voice low but furious. "Robert, you don't mean this." I rinsed my plate, dried my hands, and turned to face her. "Oh, I do." Her eyes flashed with anger. "You're willing to let Ethan's future fall apart because your feelings got hurt?" I let out a dry laugh. "Melissa, my feelings didn't get hurt. I just finally accepted the truth." She crossed her arms. "And what truth is that?" I took a deep breath, staring her straight in the eye. "That I was never part of this family. I was just the guy footing the bill." Her expression flickered, just for a second, because she knew. She knew I was right. Meanwhile, Ethan was still reeling in the dining room. He had always assumed college was covered, that no matter what, I'd be the one paying his way. But now, his entire plan was crumbling. "This isn't fair," he shouted, pushing back his chair. "You're ruining my life." I shrugged. "You made your choice, Ethan. Now live with it." His jaw clenched. "You're punishing me for nothing, just because I didn't thank you in a stupid speech?" I shook my head. "No, I'm done being disrespected. You wanted Kevin to be your dad? Well, let him handle your future." His face turned red. "Kevin doesn't have any money. You know that." I grabbed my keys, already feeling lighter than I had in years. "Then I guess you're out of luck." As I headed for the door, Melissa played her last card. "If you don't help Ethan, I don't see how this marriage can survive." I stopped, turned around, and smiled. "Then let's end it." Her face dropped. because she had expected me to beg, to backtrack, to try to fix everything like I always did. But instead, I walked out the door, and I never looked back. Within weeks, everything crumbled. Melissa filed for divorce, thinking I'd fight to win her back. Instead, I signed the papers immediately. She and Ethan moved in with Kevin, crammed into his tiny apartment with no financial security. Ethan lost his NYU spot. Without my financial backing, he had no way to pay tuition. He ended up working at a mall retail store, far from the bright future he expected. And the best part? Kevin, his real dad, was exactly who he had always been, a drunken, unreliable mess. Ethan had thrown me aside for him, and now he was paying the price. For years, I had been the rock that held them up, the responsible one, the provider, the one who was always there when they needed something. But the second I walked away, their world collapsed. And mine? It became better than ever. After the divorce was finalized, Melissa and Ethan had no choice but to move in with Kevin, which, honestly, was poetic justice. Kevin had always been Ethan's real dad, right? He was the one Ethan chose over me. So now, let him handle things for once. Except, he didn't. Because Kevin was still the same deadbeat he had always been. Lazy, unreliable, financially incompetent. And within months, Melissa was drowning in stress. Because without me, there was no stable income, no savings, no financial security. She tried to go back to work, but after years of relying on my income, she was barely making enough to cover rent and groceries. And Ethan? He was miserable. Because instead of living it up at NYU, he was working a minimum wage job, stuck in a tiny apartment with a drunk for a father and a mother who regretted everything. He had wanted Kevin to be his real dad? Well, now he had him. And it wasn't as great as he imagined. At first, they kept their pride. No calls, no texts, no messages asking for help. But after 6 months of struggling, the desperation kicked in. Ethan, hey, I know things got messy, but can we talk? Melissa, I made a mistake. We need to fix this. Ethan, I miss having you around. I stared at the messages, and then I deleted them without responding, because I didn't miss them. I didn't miss being used. I didn't miss being ignored unless they needed money. I didn't miss being the outsider in my own home. I had moved on, and there was nothing they could say to change that. Once they were out of my life, I finally felt free. I redecorated my house, removing every trace of them. I focused on my business, and my profits doubled without distractions. I reconnected with real friends, people who actually valued me. And eventually, I found someone who actually respected me. A woman who saw me as a partner, not a provider. Someone who didn't expect me to fix everything, but wanted to build a life together. And for the first time in years, I was happy. Truly, peacefully happy. Melissa and Ethan thought they would always have me to fall back on. They thought I would never walk away. But they were wrong. And the best revenge is knowing that while they're stuck living with the consequences of their choices, I've already moved on, and I will never look back.